Thank you, Dr. Palit, for trying to explain the sort of voting paradox that we saw in the 2019 elections, as well as doing some crystal ball gazing, which is always difficult. So now, I won't try and summarize the discussion since we've gone somewhat over the allotted time. So I'll open the floor for questions. I have sort of two requests. Keep your questions brief and also introduce yourself. And since this is a large audience, maybe what we'll do is try and take 3 questions at a time. And you can also say whom you're directing the questions to. Okay, so I see one hand there. Okay, why don't we start with the gentleman in blue and third, Dr. Subbarao.
Hi, thank you. My name is Nishal Mehta. My one question is that it's in 2 parts. I have 2 different questions, and one is more on the domestic aspect of it. And looking at it, this election itself has seen a huge shift as far as even the voting is concerned, where the caste-based voting was very dominant in India. And to get in states where 50% majority, you need to have to break that domination of the caste-based segregation of votes. Especially like UP had a Yadav Muslim Dalit combination, which was lethal as far as the vote bank is concerned, which has been broken. And similarly, so what do you see that this elections has created that base of or has a shift from for the future, wherein the caste system is not going to be so much of a dominant factor going forward, and everybody will be like sabka saath, sabka vikas, taking everybody together as Modi wanted. And the second question is more on the international aspect of it. Like India was normally looked up outside as more through the prism of Pakistan, and now with Modi's intention is that to isolate Pakistan and have India more integrated with other economies of the world. Where do you see that shift going forward, and how would you see that spans out? Thank you.
Okay, the second question, the young lady. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Bhavya. My question is for Dr. Amitendu Palit. My question is that you focused on a lot of sectors like railways, etc., to suggest how the government would focus on these particular sectors. What is your opinion on the banking sector, and how would the government deal with the pressures that the sector is currently the sector is currently reeling under, both the formal banking sector and the informal banking sector?
Thank you. And the final question, Dr. Subbarao, for this round.
My name is Subbarao. I'm a visiting fellow at ISAS. My question is this: will one of the long-term implications of BJP victory be the deepening or accentuation of the North-South divide in India? Kindly bear with me for a minute as I give some context to this. When India embarked on reforms in 1991, we expected an East-West divide, that if you draw a line from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, India will be divided into 2, eastern half and western half, and that the western half will grow faster than the eastern half for a very logical reason. I don't have time to explain that. But what we saw in the last over 25 years since the reforms is more of a north-south divide. The southern states growing faster, producing better social indicators, better human development index, better per capita income. Will the BJP victory, the landslide stunning victory of the Modi government, accentuate this north-south divide? Thank you.
Thank you. We have 3 quite complex questions. So can I ask Dr. Walter Andersen to address the caste question, and then the north-south divide, and then Sinder?
Is this on? Can you hear me? The caste one is interesting. It was too early to tell. There are studies that are being made right now in Lokniti, which is the agency in Delhi that sort of does polling and that sort of thing. In my mind.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, just maybe slightly closer.
There. Can you hear me now? Yeah. We're getting back to the caste issue. I think it's a little too early to tell that that this election demonstrates the diminishing of caste as a factor in elections. Much depends, and this election depended on Modi. He kind of was able to supersede a lot of the caste divisions, and people throughout the caste hierarchy were voting for him. Whether that would, mean that in the post-Modi era that would exist or not is an interesting question. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. Studies have already come out to indicate that in every major social group but two, the BJP got more than any other party and sometimes more than 50% of the vote. The two exceptions, as you might imagine, were Muslims and Christians. But every other group, including, and most importantly, the youth vote, 18 to 35, voted very strongly for Modi in all parts of the country, by the way, which is interesting because this is a group that in many ways, needs jobs and hasn't seen jobs. They voted on issue of trust that somehow jobs would show up. And if they don't show up, I think there could be a long-term problem for the government. But they voted on the question of trust. The last question had to do with...
Second question was on the possibility of a north-south divide, given the word.
Right. There already is something, and it's not new, between the Dravidian-speaking South and the north of India. I hear it. My wife is a person from South India, and so I get her interpretation of what people in the South think versus what people in the North think about issues. It is true, the South has developed more quickly in many ways, has higher education, higher, health statistics and in other areas that one measures. And the question I think had to do with, is the BJP going to exacerbate that difference? I'm not sure. The BJP has done better under Modi than any other previous government or previous leader of the party. Will it continue to establish a base? And it has in some of the Dravidian-speaking states. Karnataka is a case in point where it did quite well and got a few seats in Telangana as well, and has done better than in the past in local elections. But will it be able to sort of break out of that minority status that it has in the South? I don't know. And we may, here again, we may see a sign of that in some of the assembly elections that are coming up in India, whether it's able to do so or not. Here again, I'll stick my neck out, as one of my colleagues did a couple of times, and say, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to, but I don't think it's going to sort of help break down the barriers as well. I think we're going to have more or less what we have today. I don't think we're going to see, even though the BJP has determined that a focus on Kerala and Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, three states where it did very badly, is going to be a focus of Amit Shah's efforts. That may be, but I think there's some other issues that one has in the South that distinguishes the South somewhat from the rest of India. And beside being the Dravidian language difference, a sense of, what should I say, that we just do things better. I'll give you a sort of anecdote of my wife now, who, when asked why is it that the vast majority, and this was a couple of years ago, of India's Atomic Energy Commission people were Tamil Brahmins, and her answer was, it's because we're smarter than anybody else. And there is this kind of sense, but it's based on a cultural difference as well that you have, I think that will continue, but I don't think that endangers the Indian Union. It gives a certain competitiveness, but I don't think it endangers.
There was a question on foreign policy for Sinder.
Yeah, thanks. I think your question will be the policy of isolating Pakistan carry on and the policy of integrating India into the rest of the global economy carry on. Yes, I mean, this has been a policy for a while, but I think more importantly, maybe there's an assumption to your question, which is for a long time, India didn't want to be bracketed with Pakistan, and I think that has successfully, India managed to do it successfully. It's no longer bracketed with Pakistan. Problem here is there's a slight, the issue is, although India doesn't want to be bracketed with Pakistan, the issue of cross-border terrorism involves Pakistan. So you as much as you can bracket Pakistan out, some of the repercussions will happen anyway. So I think that's the idea is to. The other issue is the thinking in Delhi is, was it better when the Americans were Pakistan's patrons, or is it better that the Chinese are Pakistan's patrons? And the issue of how much leverage do the Chinese have on Pakistan, or is the leverage the other way around, given CPEC and the stakes involved? So I think that those kind of issues that will probably dominate the next administration. Yeah.
Thank you, Amitendu.
I'll address the question on banks. I think on banks, there is already a policy direction which has been put in place for the last 2 to 3 years. And there are 3 elements of this policy. The first is much more effective, forceful implementation of the bankruptcy code to ensure that non-performing loans are kept at a minimum. Number 2, I don't know whether it's a question of sticking my neck out, but I don't think the government wants to move the privatization path in banks. What it probably wants to go for is achieving more operational and functional efficiency by pushing a policy of consolidation of banks. And in the process, there are some banks, relatively smaller ones, which might fall off the wayside. And the third, I think, is also a policy where we might increasingly get to see some innovative ways, I'm not exactly sure how, but some innovative ways of seeing whether the banks can bring down their costs of operation and whether in some ways banking retail business can be expanded. I'm not entirely sure how this can be done, but this could be one of the ways in pushing the banks forward.
Thank you. We can move on to the second round. So the gentleman in blue first, then we'll come. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Sunil. I live in Singapore. My concern is the marginalized Muslim society in India. What happens to them with the BJP getting such majority? Will they get more marginalized? Will they feel more insecure? Are we going towards another 1947?
My name is Kaling Rajaratnam, Sri Lankan background. So Sri Lanka wasn't brought into this discussion so far. Now Sri Lanka is going to have elections in the next 12 months if everything goes to schedule. And it's very likely to have a very nationalist government elected. But this nationalist government would have very close commonalities with the BJP's nationalist platform, because they would see the threats to the two countries' national security coming from similar areas. And also this government would be pro-China, but it doesn't mean that they are, it would be both pro-China and pro-India. Which will create an interesting situation. I'm directing this question to Dr. Singh. Now, Sri Lanka is very much committed to the BRI project, with Hambantota Port playing a major role in it. And there would also be within the Sri Lankan government people involved with a new government which may come into power. People involved, senior officials who believe that Sri Lanka could become a mediator with India, getting India to be more cooperative on the BRI project and bring in China and India together. And there's one other thing which nobody mentioned. India has a project called the Mekong Ganga Cooperation project, where India is building routes in northeast India connecting to the Mekong region, using Buddhism as a cultural link. Now, this could also come into the picture, and I know there's a lot of interest in Sri Lanka joining this as well. So there could be very win-win situations coming up for the relationships in the region in terms of trade and
thank you for that
cultural relations.
We can move to the third question, right? And I'll come back to you.
Prakash Kripalani. There is already a kind of a movement towards NDA 2.0 talking about Section 370. And the proposition that is being sounded out is very...
Article 370.
Sorry.
Is Article 370.
Article 370. And the proposition that is being sounded out is very economic. If Indian companies can put in development money into Kashmir, then there'll be development, there'll be sabka saath, sabka vikas, and that will completely create jobs and the terror component will go down. How do you see the new government addressing this, and do you think this is going to be an actuality within the next 5 years?
Okay, so I guess there was the question for, again, Professor Andersen, both, I think the first question was on Muslims, and then Article 370, if you maybe can elaborate, and then Sindh.
That's a very interesting question. Actually, it's more than 370. Article 370, which gives a sort of constitutional autonomy to Jammu Kashmir. But in fact, most of that autonomy has been whittled away so that Jammu Kashmir today is almost like any other Indian state. More important was the other issue that was proposed, and that is to get rid of Article 35A. People don't talk about that, but that's where the real issue is. Yeah, because 35A, denies voting rights and property holding rights to people outside the state. And that would be a major difference. And the BJP on 35A has proposed to getting rid of 35A. I won't go into the complicated, there's a complicated set of reasons why, having to do with how it was adopted. And the argument is that in some ways it was adopted in an unconstitutional fashion. That hasn't been yet legally determined by the courts, but it is in front of the courts right now. My guess is that since 370 is the one that's in everybody's mind, that's the image, 370 is all important, I think they'd be a little more cautious. 35A, I'm absolutely convinced, and I'm willing to stick my neck out here, 35A, I think, is going to be abolished because the Kashmiri Hindus want it. In the country, I think generally there is a sense it was profoundly unfair, and it makes somewhat of a distinction of Kashmir, though Kashmir is not the only place in India where there are restrictions to owning property. There are some other places too. But that's the one that's most talked about. I think that one will be tackled. On the question of, what was the other one?
The Muslim question.
Muslim question. There is an issue there. If you look at the BJP manifesto this time and the previous manifesto, there is a difference. The previous manifesto had actually a rather long, explanation, almost a page and a half, on how a BJP government was going to improve the life of Muslims in the country. This present manifesto is absent that kind of description. Now, the government has often said that, including the Prime Minister, that, what we need to do is focus on economic development, and that improves the life of everybody. And so if we do that and successful with that, that would help Muslims. But there still is a Hindu undercurrent, both in the BJP and maybe as someone else suggested in the country as a whole. And look at, and you can see that in some obvious things, the denial of refugee status to Muslims who come in from the region, though giving it to Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, and the other groups as well who have this status. And there are other issues that have come up on this, like, using public spaces for Hindu involvement in Hindu celebrations. If I had to make a guess, I think that the government is going to be cautious about what it says and does regarding Muslims, and in hopes that it will get some Muslim support. In fact, there are, preliminary statistics indicate that the 8% that voted for the BJP last time may be doubled this time. That's not insignificant if that turns out to be the case. And in the Lokniti polling that took place about a month and a half ago, about 26% of Muslim respondents said they favored Modi as the next prime minister. Well, that's significant too, if in fact that figure represents actual reality. But I think, that, a couple things are going to happen. I think there probably will be censorship of textbooks, certain kinds of texts. I think is going to happen to emphasize a more Hindu-oriented history. On films, I think there's going to be a certain, view of what films do in that direction. And I think there's going to be more public celebration of Hindu festivals, argued that this is part of Indian culture. And therefore, we should all celebrate that. When I have friends come to Washington, D.C., I take them to the Indonesian embassy. For those of you in Washington, in front of the Indonesian embassy, there is a huge metal statue of the goddess Lakshmi. Indonesian. And they say, why can't Indian Muslims, for example, is the argument, respect our culture in the way that Indonesians apparently do? And the national dance of Indonesia, of those who have been there, you know that it's a dance based on one of the great Indian epics as well. And so that's the kind of future they envisage. But there is no doubt that, there is a sense of wariness among Indian Muslims. And you see it in the preliminary statistics that they're one of the two groups that did not vote largely for the BJP. Muslims, even though a higher percentage probably did, it's still a minority.
I think the figures are still being worked out on the Muslim vote, but the sort of cluster of questions on Sri Lanka.
Thanks, Ronojoy. I think, firstly, just to address your first, most direct point about Sri Lanka trying to play the role of a mediator, I think as long as a project is labeled as a BRI project, I don't see India taking part in it. It's a stated position, it's not going to be easy to move from there. And also, I think about 2 years ago, there were some feelers from within China about whether if they disentangle the CPEC from BRI, whether India will be happier doing something. Once again, the fact that it didn't happen also shows from the Chinese perspective, disentangling BRI from other projects, again, domestically, I don't think they can do it. So I think, I don't want to put a dampener, but I think Sri Lanka's chances of playing a mediator for India to play a role in the BRI probably, I think, quite difficult to implement. Now, 2 points. One is a smaller domestic point. You talked about the similarities about, say, you used the word nationalist parties coming to power and similar. I think one gap, or maybe something that you didn't mention, was the unresolved Tamil question, which has resonance in the south of India. And I think that will always be something that the two countries have to contend with. What do you mean by a nationalist party? Are they going to be a pro-Sinhala party, which again will pose some problems for the bilateral relationship? So I think the ball is not only in India's court, Sri Lanka's got some thinking to do as well domestically. How you want to do devolution, regional autonomy, all those things. The third point is a broader point. I'm very wary of people who try to hark back to historical analogies because people do that too easily. But there is some similarity between what's happening between India-China competition and countries in the Indian Ocean. Increasingly, and this, again, the comparison to Cold War might be too much, but increasingly, within the domestic politics, parties and groups are dividing into two. There are pro-China and anti-China factions. You see this more or less in many Indian Ocean states. Right? You see this in the Maldives, you see this in Sri Lanka to some extent. To some people say in the wider Indo-Pacific, the Southeast Asian countries as well, domestic constituencies split into two. And again, this is a very interesting development because this can lead to some unwelcome kind of strategies, which were reminiscent of what used to happen to the Cold War. I just need to topple a regime, right? Because one regime will be pro-me. If they are pro-me, they're fine. The next regime comes in, I'll topple the regime. So some people say the Maldives, that's what happened, but through an election. Sri Lanka, that's what happened, but through an election. But of course, we know interference in elections is not something that is fantasy, it happens. So again, I think this is an interesting, broader kind of development about how domestic politics is becoming framed. Even the discourse you see, who is pro-China, who's not pro-China. And I think this is a very interesting development. Thanks.
We are running out of time, so we'll have a very quick final round, very short questions and very short replies too. Okay, so the gentleman, in the back, and then Rani. Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Please, very brief. Yeah.
Sure. Following the criticism Facebook received for countering of disinformation, hate speech, and for political partiality during and prior to the election, what's the likelihood of, in your opinion, of comprehensive governmental effort to regulate large social media platforms? And would you affirm the purported global significance of this move?
Yeah, please.
My name is Mahalakshmi. My question is directed to Professor Andersen. Across the globe, we see this rise of populism, and liberals are actually losing the narrative battle everywhere. And they're apparently not able to still understand what is it that is going wrong and why are people not voting according to their preset ideas. One psephologist in India even called the people who voted as idiots for not voting according to the way he had predicted. So my question is, will the elites ever be able to understand where they are going wrong, and will they reflect on this?
Thanks. The final question. Oh, okay. Yeah, you please.
My name is Yamuna. This doesn't come across as a question, but I would like to know if I'm right. These were points that I didn't hear from the panel. There were, in my opinion, 3 things that were very important that, apart from the economics and the propaganda that was done by BJP and other things. One was the clean image that Modi and his government have had. So there was nothing that could be accurately pointed as, they were involved in some scams. That is one image. Second was the way he exuded power by way of demonetization, GST, the way it was introduced, and these security issues that were handled, Doklam and then Pakistan. And the third, which is kind of translated as Hindutva, was actually the Hindu pride that was missing, which is rising again. Hindus, I don't know, outside of India, they've always been misrepresented as somebody inferior to the rest of the world. And this has been brought up. And these were points that I feel have played a key role in some of the people voting.
And the final question for Rani Mullen.
My question is on democracy and institutions, and it builds on, I think, the implied question that was there in Chairman Pillai's comments. There was criticism under Modi 1.0 about what was happening to India's institutions. And I'm wondering what all the panelists, including the chair's views are on, given the high margin of victory that Modi had, much higher than any predictions seem to have put out there, what is your prediction? What will happen to the RBI, to the autonomy of India's judiciary? Broadly, what is your prediction for India's democracy and the fate of its institutions? Thanks.
Since we are really out of time, I'll let Professor Andersen sort of give a quick 2-minute reply.
Yeah, those are all great questions, and the points you raised, Ronnie, were great points, but it takes more time than I think you're willing to give us on that, so maybe you and I can talk about that. Very quickly, on democracy, I'm confident that given the complexity of India, democracy will persist in this country because of that complexity. And I would urge you to read an article which I totally disagree with. I think gives all the wrong reasons why democracy is in danger, and is Pankaj Mishra's article in Bloomberg. And take a look at that. And if you read it and got angry like I did, you can see, because he has all the international stereotypes about why India is going wrong, and this is not new for him. So I'm confident that, given the complexity of India and the institutions, and that it's going to take a lot more than this that we have now. We face it'll have to take a crisis of several crises in order to sort of undermine democracy in this country. We saw that when the only time it really happened was during the 75 to 77, when Indira Gandhi in effect put democracy and politics and on the back burner, and she was really forced to go to the elections, and she lost, and she accepted that loss. What was it? There was another question about a very good question. The lady in pink here, right? What was?
On populism.
Populism, yeah. Well, that's a similar sort of issue. It's different from. I'm always suspicious of these international comparisons, Every country is different from any other. Therefore, terms that are used to characterize, for example, Nazi Germany, is not a term that would necessarily be applicable here or applicable in Japan, because every country has its distinct characteristics of what is happening. Normally, when people use those terms, they normally think of the terms that, Rana, you mentioned, is what is the fate of democracy in a country. And I think some of these movements may have an impact on democracy, some will not. In the Indian case, I really don't think they will, unless we have some significant crisis, far more than what we've seen now, like the defeat of India in the war or something like that, I think, or a total collapse of the economy, which would turn people, because what leads to populist sentiment is a sense that the establishment is working against your interests. And that's the kind of overview that people, how Trump won, everyone was surprised. Because there was a large part of the country that felt that the administration of the United States was not working in their interest. I don't think you get that in India yet. In fact, I think the election results indicate that many Indians have hope that the government is going to work in their interest. Is the Indian government populist? It depends on specific circumstances of what it is, and I'm not sure you can compare it to populism, as many people do, and Pankaj Mishra does, in fact, in his article, populism in, the U.S., populism in Australia, where you had a recent conservative government come, in Brazil or the U.S. Does this fit into that? I don't like to use those comparisons because I think they ignore the cultural differences, which are important for various countries. So for those of us who have regional, stresses in our work, and we do, don't give that up, because I think that's going to be necessary in understanding how regions work. You have to know the region.
Thank you, Professor Andersen. Unfortunately, I'll have to bring this discussion to a close. May I now ask, John to make the final announcements.
Thank you, Dr. Sen, and all the panelists. To conclude the proceedings, I would like to invite Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director, ISAS, to deliver the closing remarks. Professor Mohan, please.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I will stick to Singapore rule and just make 3 observations to bring this to a close. Firstly, I just want to thank all of you for coming in such large numbers for this event. We've been receiving very generous, strong response from all of you for the last many events. So we're really thankful to all of you, and we hope that we can keep up this tempo. And we have our events team here. I think they're under great pressure, but we've been stepping up our activity, and the more we get this kind of response, the more we're going to do. But I think the purpose is to try and make it more relevant, more interesting to the stakeholders in Singapore. So we promise that what we've received in the last few months, we can keep it up in the coming days. Second, I think the main question, and I think not going to try and summarize the discussion. The big question that was asked, is this an inflection point? The answer was yes, but the question is by how much? My sense is this is a big inflection point. I think there were at least 2 other points of inflection. Of course, 1947, when an indigenous regime, took over India. It outlined a set of policies, if you want to simplify, the Congress hegemony domestically, a socialist economy, and a non-aligned foreign policy. So the period from 1947, shall we say, to 1991 at least, was 1989 to be precise, was this period where these 3 features dominated Indian economy. And then in 89-91, we had a discontinuity, and the discontinuity saw the collapse of a strong domestic majority, the fragmentation of Indian polity, the rise of the forces of regionalism and casteism and communalism, that you've seen a political structure fragmented, but then it was also a period when India had to reorient its economic policies, where under compulsion from the bankruptcy that emerged in 1991, India undertook historic economic reforms. And that period, I think, between 1991 came to a close, I would say 2014. That is 2019 an inflection point. In my belief, it is 2014 that was an inflection point. And what 2019 has done is to show the consolidation of what began in 2014, a single party majority. And with it, I think, has come not just a new party taking over, but a fundamental realignment of domestic politics. Whether, the 50% vote question, which both some of my panelists here touched upon, that it shows that there is a structural realignment going on within India. And my sense is this will last for some time, but this quite clearly the kind of tools by which we analyzed Indian politics for the last, between 1991 to 2014, that must give way to understanding the nature of the realignment. And part of this is also rise of a new elite, which is not the elite, the post-independence urban elite that we've historically used to, the rest of the world has engaged with, but it's a very different elite. And I think part of the problem in understanding India has also been this new elite, which is taking charge. And I think understanding that is going to be a big task for all of us. Then the question of economic reform that Mr. Modi promised a lot. I mean, he did some major reforms during 2014 to 19, GST, some of you mentioned that. And the idea that, look, India was going to do much more was not met. So the big question then is, what happens in the next 5 years? I mean, I don't want to speculate, but my sense is that there are times when you have a strong government, it can do big things. We've seen in the previous era, weak governments actually under pressure from outside doing reforms. But my sense is that while India has done well and continues to do well, there is external pressure today to do some reorientation. Because a large sectors of reform are undone, and some of those issues are going to come to head. And my sense is there will be some change, whether it will meet the expectations or not. We've heard from Amitendu some of that. But my sense is that it cannot continue the same form, that it will have to adapt. And the question is how much of an adaptation, how much of boldness, and how much of a conservative approach. And I think it takes us back to 1992 in China, where Deng Xiaoping, of course, comparisons are odious, when Deng Xiaoping prevented China from going back to a conservatism, went on a southern tour and said, look, we're going to open up. Somewhat like that, I mean, of where India will have to signal welfareism, signal support to large number of people, but at the same time, it has to open up the economy. Without that, it'll get trapped in a middle-income economy, middle-income status, and my sense is that there would be an effort, whether they'll succeed or not, to change the orientation of the Indian economy. On foreign policy, the last period we saw was a dramatic expansion of India-US relationship, more broadly between India and the West. My sense is this will go on. We have a bit of a wrinkle on trade issues with the Americans, but my sense is there'll be serious effort at resolving those set of issues. And in the end, I think if you understand India's foreign policy in the new age, the whole framework of non-alignment, the whole framework of India as a defensive power, we'll have to replace that with a country is going to be $3 trillion this year, a country that is going to be the third largest economy. So the attitude that Modi has brought to India's engagement with the world, it's going to be a confident nation that's willing to explore all possible collaborations and is not going to be defensive. And that idea is going to change, I think, the way India is going to relate to the world, that it wants to be a power in its own right, that we're not going to be pro-American or pro-Chinese. As our current foreign minister, who was our distinguished fellow, once said, which side are you going to take, Indian, American side or Chinese side? He said, India side. So I think India has a historic moment today as the US-China relationship enters a turbulence. The production chains in East Asia are going to be redone. The security conflict between US and China is going to grow. India's leverage, if it plays it right, is going to dramatically increase in the coming months. So the story of it, I think next 3 years, for those of our friends in Singapore, India is going to matter more, even if it does not do dramatic reforms. Given the conflict that is emerging between US and China, that there will be search for alternative markets. There will be search for alternative partners as the new Cold War begins to envelop this region. There, I would think Southeast Asia as a whole, Singapore in particular, and our friends in the region, I think will benefit a lot from exploring potential engagements with India. And as a director of ISAS, and with the strong support from the chairman, I promise you that we're going to be contributing to help understand this new moment, which is a historic moment in the region as a whole and a growing salience of India in this context. So let me stop here. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists and our team that really pulled this off. So thank you, and please join us for this tea outside. Oh, you're going to announce it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mohan. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the panel discussion. On behalf of ISAS and RSIS, I thank all of you for your participation in the event. We look forward to seeing you again, and I wish you all a good day.